Sal, welcome to Real Talk.
Thanks, Dean.
So,
Great to be here.
so what problem is DePIN solving? Let's start high level.
Yeah, I think DePIN is a really broad category, but it is kind of for the maximally ambitious founders that want to solve the base problems of society. It's like how people get internet, how they get energy to their homes, how they transport themselves, or the things that they need to live from one place to another. And so DePIN in its a 20 or 30-year timeline kind of solves all these problems. And how do we enable people to do this in a way that cuts out the middleman and gives sort of the most economics back to the people who are actually contributing to the network? And the first instantiations of that were kind of like radio networks with Helium, or sensor networks. And now we're seeing, a lot more entrepreneurs that are opening up to crypto and building new kinds of networks using crypto incentives to kind of bootstrap the initial network and then to monetize and operate it going forward.
So why is right now the right time for DePIN?
DePIN has a bunch of qualities that for investors is really exciting, that I think answers that question about why now, which is just structurally users demand more from infrastructure every single year. Like if you look since probably the year 1999, users have used like between 35% and 45% more data every single year over year for 20 years. And that trend has almost never broken. So there's a lot of confidence that, you'll keep over 20 years. That's 10,000x growth. And that'll probably keep happening as new applications come online. So the reason why DePIN is so important now is because the old models of deploying a telecom network just don't work if you keep compounding. They work today, but structurally the economics and physics of them don't work if you keep compounding that 35-40% growth a couple more years out. So it kind of there is no other solution to sort of continuing to provide service, the level of service that people want out of their internet connectivity. And so that's why, specifically for that use case of radio networks, it'll be something has to happen. There has to be some way to coordinate people to deploy radios more densely, smaller radios that can transmit more data per square footage in really dense areas. And that's going to have to be through using crypto incentives, because the industry has been trying for the past 10 years to do it in a centralized way, and it hasn't worked. So, and they don't really innovate that quickly. So they're not going to try anything else. Basically, it's up to us to go and, for me as an investor, to go find entrepreneurs, and for entrepreneurs to go build that future, who can make it happen. I think the other example is in the energy market, for example, users really they want renewables. People want the security of having solar energy in their home that they can have a battery and sort of control and have sovereign, have a little bit less reliance on the grid as they see the grid failing more often. And how the grid is structured today, it cannot handle the level of renewables. Your renewables obviously you get them during the day, but not at night. And so it doesn't match up with the demand usage patterns, which usually use the most electricity in the afternoon and then late at night. So again, this is a problem where we know that if solar keeps growing at the pace it has for the past 5 or 10 years, for another 5 years, structurally the grid is going to break. And so there has to be something that gives. Even, we have a lot of conviction that it is DePIN, but if it's not DePIN, then somebody better figure it out, because if not, we're really all screwed. The way to solve these problems is through a community-driven approach. So we're confident that it'll be a DePIN entrepreneur that figures out how to crack and scale it.
So the problem essentially is that the problem has grown too large. The amount of demand has grown too large for centralized teams to scale effectively and meet it. So you need a decentralized response. You articulated the Helium thesis essentially. So as an investor, where does this value accrue in DePIN?
It's a really hard question to answer. I think it's very early in crypto networks in general, a new way to operate and build and finance companies. And we're still pretty early in how to pull those different levers. By analogy, you can look at some of the tech companies that were built, that were started in 2004, 2005. In retrospect, those companies were not run very well. And, a lot of them survived zero interest rates, but now are dying. And it's the same thing, we're much earlier in crypto, where a lot of the tools in terms of customer acquisition, of retention, on economics, on operating, they're very early. And also the operating realities is a minefield. It's your bank account might get shut down, you might not have, you might get hacked. There's all these things that make it hard to start a network. So I think what the goal of DePIN, like what investors and entrepreneurs are trying to solve, is to create a system where there's all of sort of the demand accrues value to that one single entity, and there's no middleman. It's just everyone has ownership over the same kind of asset, and that asset, you would assume that it grows like 35% then every year, the same amount as the demand, because this infrastructure, once you build it, can be used. The replacement rate is pretty low. Like a lot of infrastructure lasts 20 or 30 years once you install it, so it can support a lot of growth. And I think the goal, the ideal, is to have one single asset. I think in a lot of these ecosystems that represents like one. If I have one HNT token, hopefully that's like over 223 million percentage of like the total capacity of the Helium network at some point in the future. If Helium is this global wireless network, then I have my pro rata proportional share of that. And so, how do you sort of get to that phase is, I think, an open question and there's a lot of people working on different approaches to that problem. And I think a collaborative approach helps a lot of founders, because we're still so early in the space of figuring out what the right approach is. But for investors, the value, I think, is in the capital efficiency of infrastructure. Like if we can deploy infrastructure once that's valuable, it's going to get used more and more every year. And inflation, it's some of the most inflation resistant kind of investments that you can have are these, they have a moat because there's no point in replicating them. So once you have one, it's a one of one type of network at scale.
And it scales with demand, with actual usage. So you were an investor in MachineFi Labs, which is an infrastructure company, essentially, organization, IoTex. So I want to ask you about what tech needs to be built to allow DePIN dApps to scale to meet this enormous compounding demand.
Yeah, there's a lot. For us as investors, we take a 20 or 30-year timeline view on the space, and that's how long we want to be investing for. Basically, our entire careers behind DePIN. And so, when we think about that long of timescales, really the benefit is like talent. Like what kind of people are you attracting into the space to build this? And for DePIN, it's people. To compare to like the legacy telco energy industries, like when was the last time you met somebody like under 25 that wanted to go, like their ambition was to go work at a utility or energy company? Like there's a small amount of they exist, but it's a very small amount of people.
Sure. And they're not at Stanford usually.
Yeah. And really, like, how do you build a global energy grid? Or like radios are really sick to learn about in terms of how do you design them and economics. Like they're real engineering problems that are super interesting. So for us, the benefit of platforms like MachineFi, like the thing that they're bringing that's so important to the ecosystem is there's all this like crypto tools that's replicated by every team right now, that needs to be replicated because the infrastructure is super early, and that puts away a lot of people who are like hardware nerds who really like building, and don't as much like the like adversarial nature. Like in crypto, you have to design always in this adversarial kind of way for anything you put on chain, like that can get arbed will be arbed in a long enough time frame. And so building a product or infrastructure that manages that reality, I think, is very difficult. And so platforms like MachineFi that abstract all that away, and builders can easily come and in a couple of lines of code or clicks or whatever go and integrate their product into interact with blockchains in different ways, and it becomes a runway into like much deeper integrations and more putting more data, more rights, more governance into the like on-chain information for these networks over time. That's why I think it's so important. Is just the net new talent that platforms like MachineFi can bring and IoTex can bring into DePIN in terms of experimentation, and getting people, instead of spending 2 or 3 years building infrastructure, like starting now. Like if you look at historically, before platforms like MachineFi or IoTex had launched, like Render, I think, for example, has been building in the space for a couple of years now. They were originally their own token. Then in 2021, they moved to Polygon. Now they're moving to Solana. Helium kind of had their own layer 1, and now is switching to Solana as well. There are projects that have moved between chains multiple times, and the the out-of-the-box solution to sort of solve a lot of these problems just creates a lot more experimentation. The hard thing about DePIN is that super hard to iterate on, like, it takes 6 or 9 months usually to get a hardware product out there.
Right.
So the iteration cycles are so slow without the crypto side. And if you add the crypto side, it almost becomes unmanageable. So we expect to see, and we're already seeing a lot of like net new entrepreneurial activity from DePIN founders through IoTex.
Nice. So as an investor, you're usually looking, as you just said, as far out as 30 years. But can you give us a snapshot of where DePIN is right now in terms of adoption, use cases?
There's an incredible amount of new projects launching every single day that are attacking like every corner of the space with increasingly creative ways of going to market, of different assets that people are bringing in terms of properties or specific technical knowledge that they can integrate into protocols. I think that's the amazing thing about crypto, is that anyone that has some like special edge or unique asset can try and build a protocol around it and see how it competes in the marketplace. And so the number of net new entrepreneurs again that are coming in is really incredible. In terms of, if I had to quantify the amount of like total revenue or maybe capital raised into the space, like that, there's probably been $500 million of capital raised in total between like adjacent companies. I think a lot of what we're seeing is smaller companies like in the Web2 world are realizing that like their business should have never been equity financed, and it should have been token financed in the ideal way, and that's the right way to scale their infrastructure. And so it's a little bit of a gray area because they're not they weren't originally DePIN projects, but they're rapidly realizing that in their final form they kind of are. And so these are businesses that will slowly kind of like integrate token economies into their existing business. And you as a user may not even realize it at first that it becomes a crypto network, but over time you start to see more economics flow to you, or you start to new features like staking or that are sort of like gamified incentives within the infrastructure that show up. And it's, making that transition, I think, is it's like the product, that's the fun of it. It's the product development cycle and competing and trying to find out who can build the most compelling thing for users.
So what does a maximally successful DePIN ecosystem look like, let's say in a 5 or 10 year time horizon?
So I started off my crypto journey as a Bitcoin maximalist for the first couple of years, way back in like 2013.
Nice.
And the beautiful thing about Bitcoin back then was like it professionalized faster than any industry ever, right? Like in 2013, I like ran a miner on my laptop and I like was earning some Bitcoin. It was amazing. By 2015, it was like, okay, now there were some entrepreneurs who went all in and were making money on these big farms. And with a couple $1,000s, you could probably still compete. By 2017, it's like, all right, these are all like real companies that are competing. Now that they started going public, and now there's like this robust ecosystem like across countries of different miners, and like we saw China shut down Bitcoin mining, and the whole rest of the world just absorbed it. Like the industry in 10 years professionalized faster than anything we've really ever seen. Like the margins in the Bitcoin mining industry are zero.
Yeah.
They pretty much operate at cost. And so what I think of as the maximally successful DePIN network, and this is like the investor in me speaking, is like it should approach like zero margin. Like the miners should be close to maximally efficient as possible at whatever the activity that they're doing is, whether it's data collection or sensors or providing telco service or energy. Like it should be enabling the lowest cost producer everywhere to be the only ones that are competitive and have rock bottom costs for users. And because the costs are so low, people are going to find net new ways to build on top of it, and there'll be like new use cases that we can't imagine now that are possible, whether it's connectivity or electricity or transportation or we all walk around with smartphones. There's 5 or 6 billion in the world right now. Like these are extremely powerful platforms that I think we're still super early in exploring how to build global networks around them.
But there's a downside to that rapid professionalization in the sense that it leads to economies of scale and centralization. In some sense, DePIN, its beauty comes from the fact that it, at least right now, isn't professionalized. Like with Helium, for example, it's heading that way, but can we retain that decentralization and also professionalization?
there's nothing in life is free. Like I think people will ultimately, the equilibrium is that people will get paid for the value they bring to the network. That's not to say that individuals can't bring value to the network. They bring a lot of value to the network, but it's a different kind of value than a lot of the production. Like I think the supply side for a lot of DePIN networks will ultimately end up being professionalized, and it's the people that look like amateurs today that end up, you know, raising money or making a big bet, reinvesting their rewards or whatever, and kind of like becoming those entrepreneurs that do it. But I think it is inevitable that eventually it becomes really competitive for the supply side. I think there are other ways of engaging users, like HiveMapper, for example, uses users to like tag their maps that are recorded from the dash cams on the other side of the marketplace, which is cars. So I think over time, networks will get better and better at sort of allocating the pie proportional to the value that people bring, and the timing of that is like that. That's the whole idea of like designing an incentive system is really hard. But again, platforms like MachineFi can help people design really early without too much effort, kind of an initial prototype that they can then iterate on and get to the optimal solution over time. And you know, nobody knows how to build these things at the beginning, so the important thing is to get started and then move in the right direction a little bit every day.
So as an investor in MachineFi Labs, how do you see WebStream fitting into the DePIN vision over the next few years?
I think WebStream is the first place that developers should go to kind of experiment with DePIN. That is the core part of the ecosystem. Now there's a lot of we can link the docs or something at the end of this podcast, but there's a lot of resources out there that MachineFi has built to go deeper and deeper and enable like a lot more functionality for these DePIN entrepreneurs to put their networks on chain. But I think the most important thing is like, if you want to experiment and dip your toes into DePIN and see what it's like, understand what it's like for a hardware network or hardware devices to interact with a permissionless blockchain and how you might think about engineering those solutions, IoTeX and MachineFi and the WebStream platform are the way to start doing that and kind of experiment and iterate from there.
Nice. Sal, thanks so much for your time and insights today.
Yeah, thank you, Dane, for having me.